Hi class, my name is Alex Olson, and this is my expert brief. I wanted to present to you what I believe to be the biggest current threat in America today that has a law enforcement nexus. So first off, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about terrorism. And I know this may seem a little strange because previously, and I'll still argue this, I do not think that terrorism should be a prioritization of law enforcement. I do not think law enforcement is suited well to combat terrorism. However, I do believe that law enforcement does have a role in terrorism investigations, and I do believe that they can make an impact, a positive impact. I just do not think that they are the specific party to be handling terrorism. But terrorism does have a criminal nexus, and I'm going to explain why. So first off, what are we talking about? Terrorism. Terrorism has a criminal nexus because when you look at the FBI definition of terrorism, and the definitions of terrorism are going to vary, but I use the FBI's definition because they are the main federal law enforcement body that we typically talk about. Their definitions include the words violent, and I quote, criminal acts. So that should be the key indicator, criminal acts. Terrorism is a crime. Therefore, it becomes the FBI and overall law enforcement's problem, becomes their responsibility, and is now within their purview. Now, when we think of the word terrorism, we think of the intelligence community, international politics, maybe even warfare to a certain extent. But ultimately, it is a crime to kill other people. It is still murder. The reasons and the motives behind the murder are the only things that change. Ideological reasoning, religious, socioeconomic, political, the list can go on, but nonetheless, it is a crime and therefore becomes a law enforcement matter. Now, any citizen murdered abroad is typically going to be in the FBI's jurisdiction. The FBI is also going to take over any investigation that happens here domestically. So whether it's domestic terrorism or international terrorism, it doesn't matter. It's still the FBI's jurisdiction. So to give a little bit of background on terrorism, terrorism is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. Only recently has it become more mainstream, especially since 9/11, when obviously terrorism brought down the Twin Towers and took us sort of into this new era that we see ourselves. Even non-state actors who are less equipped, less educated than their typically more well-off peers. It's even the tactic of choice for actual states around the world, and they call that state-sponsored terrorism. Mainly because asymmetric warfare is a real thing nowadays. To wage a pitched war against the US or any one of its allies, or even one of the larger superpowers, China, Russia, the US, any one of the security members or Security Council members, is a fleeting thought. So a lot of these smaller countries, non-state actors, state actors, individuals even, find it's easier to wage war against the United States or any other country for that matter, using terrorism. It's a crude, easy tactic, many times can be cheap or inexpensive, and doesn't require a whole lot of planning, depending upon what act you want to try to carry out. We see very crude acts with simple vehicle terrorism or vehicular terrorism, which is simply driving through a crowd of people for some reason. We also see highly sophisticated, highly planned terrorist attacks, such as 9/11, where it takes multiple months to plan, multiple individuals are involved. There's hundreds of thousands, if not even a couple $1 million involved, and it's a highly complicated plot by taking over airliners flown by American pilots inside the United States. So I believe that terrorism is the same, the murder is the same, the criminal nexus remains the same. The only thing that changes is the reasoning behind it and the manner in which it's carried out, the extent, planning, everything like that. However, this does not mean that intelligence community members cannot get involved. So this is what makes terrorism sort of strange. You're going to have a criminal matter investigated by an intelligence community member. You're going to have a criminal matter investigated by a federal law enforcement entity. So, and we've talked about this too, the division of civil rights versus intelligence community, and the wall, which is what Treverton references when he's mentioning Cofer Black and how much he was really wanting to hear from federal law enforcement and how much he could tell federal law enforcement. So that's what puts terrorism at this strange positioning within the United States. Is it's going to be investigated by law enforcement, but it's also going to be handled by the intelligence community to a certain degree. So my analysis concluded that the reasoning behind law enforcement having a role within terrorism is because they can initiate investigations. They can initiate consensual questioning. People can consent to be questioned. Now, the FBI in their Homegrown Violent Extremism Handbook, which was published last year, and it's in concert with the DHS and the National Counterterrorism Center, says that a majority of alarming homegrown violent extremist behavior is going to be viewed by friends and family, peers, coworkers, things like that. So that's something that an intelligence community member is not going to get involved with. That's going to be a law enforcement matter. Because again, intelligence community members cannot act off of suspicion alone. This is protected by free speech. However, law enforcement, without conducting any unconstitutional searches and seizures, can go and probe and see what's going on, question the friends and family, question the subject themselves, and hopefully expose, mitigate, and or even prevent the act from occurring. So that's where law enforcement has the role, is people start asking questions when you have intelligence community members coming into the mix, because it's a privacy issue. There is no crime. And any unlawful methods used by these intelligence community members can create civil rights violations. And a whole host of issues come from those. However, if law enforcement asks questions, they're simply just questions. If the subject doesn't want to cooperate, then that's on them, and they don't have to. So that's where law enforcement comes into play. When you look at terrorism, you see a number of SATs that can be used. SATs are structured analytical techniques that a lot of analysts use to brainstorm through issues, and brainstorming itself is even an SAT. But the two that I really, really like, and they're mainly two in one, they're sort of the same thing, sort of not, are role-playing and or red hat or red cell. There's a number of different words you can use, but they allow you to constantly step into the mind of your enemy and forecast any of your own vulnerabilities, your own lapses in defense. And no matter who changes, so we see a lot of Al-Qaeda leaders being imprisoned, killed, leaders of other terrorist networks being imprisoned or killed. It doesn't matter who's in power. As long as you can step into their mind frame, their frame of thinking, you can constantly evolve your way of thinking and your responses. And so, again, the threat stays the same, the way of thinking changes. So that's the only thing you need to account for. It's an OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. You're constantly getting that feedback. And so you can constantly reevaluate your actions and your counterterrorism techniques. And so I think that that's an extremely effective SAT. And that's one that I actually use at work as a police officer. I use that, how, what would a criminal do in this situation? How can I act like them? How can I think like them? And then how can I mold my actions off of that frame of thinking? So that's why terrorism has a criminal nexus. That is why law enforcement has a role within terrorism investigations. And that is the correct essay, or that is the SAT that I believe is the most correct or most on to analyze terrorism and the criminal nexus. And again, I know that's contrary to what I've been saying before, but I do believe that whether or not you're law enforcement, you do have a role in terrorism investigations, and it's going to be paired with the intelligence community. So they both have a role. We just need to be mindful of our constitutional and civil rights subject matter, and hopefully things will be okay and we can expose some hopefully horrendous events which have yet to happen. So look forward to the discussion. Any questions I hope to answer, and have a good rest of your day.